So we are getting ready here to start in a minute.
Okay. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, maybe good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Rainer Axter. I'm Executive Board Member at Adelphi. We are Think and Do Tank, supporting the IDFC climate facility with technical assistance. And I'm very happy, very proud to be able to moderate this panel here at COP26. We have a whole series of distinguished guests here on the panel, some of them virtual. So we have 4 colleagues with us virtually, and we have 2 and 1 person we're still expecting here in person. I will introduce them then one by one. Here you can see them on the screen, our virtual speakers. Our topic today is how to unlock barriers to scaling up climate finance. And that's also, I have to say, very close to my heart, because I think one of the big challenges is that we now have to scale up. And we work a lot with financial institutions. And if I know one thing about bankers, they like big. Big numbers, big sizes, that's definitely something which is out there. And that's something often forgotten, like by the climate community, because they like impact. And so that's where we have to get. We have to form impact at scale. I think that's what the topic is going to be about today. And I hope we're going to have an interesting and a very, maybe also a little bit controversial discussion, let's see, with the different elements here. At the moment, it's sometimes a lot of things are smaller scale, at least for banking dimensions. And so often the projects are not that well documented. There is the question of private capital, how to get private capital on board, to have a mix between private and public money coming together. Hello.
Hello.
We have the topic of an investment according to global roadmap, and of course the policymakers, which have announced here this week and will also announce next week their objectives, have to be brought in line. And we yesterday had a presentation by KfW, which said we don't make the policies, we implement the policies. So the question is how to implement these policies which have been made at scale. And that's what we're here today for. To kick us off, I would like to invite Baysa Naran. She's a senior analyst at Climate Policy Initiative in the London office. And she's also in charge of the climate finance tracking workstream at CPI. And she and her team every year do the global landscape on climate finance. And what I'm very curious at, Baysa, if you could kick us off here on the presentation, is how do we get to scale? And where do you see the issues of getting to scale? So please, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. And I think the topic you raised is very, very important. And I think my presentation will give you an overview about the scale we are actually talking about and the current situation we're in. So, I mean, should I share my screen?
No, we're going to do it from here. They're going to see it, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so just a quick background about the presentation I'm going to be talking about today. Global landscape of climate finance is the most comprehensively available data and information on the global primary investment in climate mitigation and adaptation. The Climate Policy Initiative has been doing this for over a decade, and it provides a very comprehensive overview on the life cycle of climate finance, from sources to intermediaries, financial instruments, users, and finally in how it's used to which sectors. And it has been informing policymakers. In the next slide, please. We provide input to the UNFCCC's biennial assessment and overview of climate finance flows. This year, we have also been supporting the IPCC 6th annual report, annual assessment report. and it's used in a lot of other key publications. On the next slide, it's the Sankey diagram of our landscape report from 2021, and it provides the annual climate finance flows in 2019 and 2020. So 632 billion is an annual climate finance flow, average one. Let me just take you through the key findings, and the report itself has a lot to say, but you know, you're more than welcome to have a look on our website. But just for today's discussion, I'll present some key findings from the next slides. Next slide. Yeah. So the annual climate finance flow in 2019 and 2021 reached 632 billion American dollars. You know, although it's the record climate finance flows, the growth in the last 4 years has been tepid compared to how much growth we've seen in the previous years, where climate finance flows were increasing annually by like 24–25%. And in 2019 and 2020, we've seen only 10% increase. And that's a little bit worrying because we're yet to see the impact of global pandemic. And you know, we're going to see the effects of it in the next couple of years. And then when you frame it to the actual needs, the picture is even more scaring in the next slide. So this year we've done a detailed literature review on the information that's available on the climate finance needs, both in the mitigation and adaptation terms. So we've only taken the low bound investment needs. And as you can see, the current investment flows fall very short of what's required in the next 10 years and also all the way through 2050. So it means that we need actually trillions and not billions in climate finance flows. So in the next slide, I'd also like to frame, you know, we're not talking about some trillions that are impossible to get. The money's there. So for example, we spend trillions annually in a light duty vehicle alone that consume petrol. And compared to how much we spend, the battery electric vehicles are a very small share. And similarly, we build new buildings that are high energy intensive. And our power mix currently is largely fossil fuel based. Although we're spending renewable energy projects, I mean, we still need to scale it up. So in the next slide, I'm going to take you further into the uses of climate finance. The majority of climate finance still continues to be tilted towards mitigation finance. So about 90% of all climate finance flows are dedicated to mitigation activities. So things like renewable energy projects or low carbon transport projects and other mitigation related projects. But I would also like to highlight some good news. As you can see, adaptation finance has gained momentum. It increased from 30 billion annually in 2017 and 2018 to 46 billion. So it's largely because of a few multilateral development banks stepping up and increasing their commitments to adaptation finance. But I'd also like to highlight in the next slide that the adaptation needs are also very short of the literature available on the needs, and the mixture of adaptation and mitigation finance should really, you know, balance, right. Further, let's have a look into the actors that make climate finance commitments. So if we look into the public actors, we see that all climate finance flows, 51% of all climate finance flows are made possible by public actors. So in the last couple of years, we've been revising our methodology around what we define as public actors, and we started to include state-owned entities as public actors, and we see that now national development finance institutions, multilateral development finance institutions, and state-owned financial institutions play a big role in terms of public actors. And then in the next slide, commercial financial institutions, from the private sector, currently provides 49% of all climate finance flows. And then in the last 2 years, we've seen that commercial financial institutions made the biggest stride in growth. And we explain and understand this trend that there are more initiatives around green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, so that the role of commercial financial institutions is increasing in terms of facilitating climate mitigation, mostly climate mitigation projects. Right. So the other point I'd like to make is that in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of commitments made by the private sector on various targets, including net zeros or investment goals. And especially in the year 2021 has been just booming in climate announcements. But the thing is, there are only 12 entities so far that set interim portfolio emissions targets, and there are still more details required about all these targets, how they're going to operationalize these targets, and how they're going to translate into the real investment in the economy. And in the next slide, I'd like to touch base on a few points about data availability. So information on investment levels from the private sector, for example, in adaptation, buildings and industry sectors are scarce. So it's just that there's no mechanism for the private sector to collectively report on how much investment is going into these activities. And the thing is, it's really essential to have this information to understand where the finance is going and essentially to craft effective policies. And also similarly, domestic public expenditure on climate-related activities is not universally available, but this could be actually a very critical information to mainstream and integrate climate framework, policies and laws into national and sectoral budgets. Right. So just a few slides on the geographic distribution of climate finance. So here we see that 75% of all climate finance currently flows in mainly 3 regions. So this is US and Canada, Western Europe, and East Asia and Pacific, mostly dominated by China. Whereas the rest 25% of climate finance flows are largely driven by international climate finance in mostly developing economies. And the next slide. This just shows the breakdown of which regions raise capital through which from which sectors, right? So and we can see that US and Canada, they draw most of climate finance from private sectors. Western Europe is balanced, but Sub-Saharan Africa, here we see that it's really mostly international climate finance by public actors, and there's not a lot happening from the private sector, basically. Right. So I'll just conclude my presentation with a few points on our recommendations. So firstly, it's very, very clear that the scale of finance needs to increase this decade. As we say that the decade that will make or break the transition to a sustainable net zero world. No actor is on track to meet net zero. No actor is contributing enough of climate finance. Both public and private actors need to step up to bridge the gap on climate finance. And secondly, we're still missing a lot of information on credible climate action and impact on the ground. We're seeing incredible amount of commitments and targets, but now we need to prioritize data on what really actually happens and how things translate as a reality. And thirdly, we need credible net zero commitments with clear transition plans. And we also need interim goals for 2030. And finally, we need structural changes focusing on the nexus between the environment, the economy, and the people. So I'd like to close my presentation with just maybe a question to all the panelists or everyone in the room. In the next slide, the final slide, is just the picture around the current finance flows and the needs in the, if you could click on the next slide, yeah. So this really frames our today's discussion about where's our current investment flows and where we ideally need to be. And I'm very curious to hear from you, how do we bridge this gap on the investment levels required? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baysa. Thank you for kicking us off and also for showing the picture. Of course, there are different views on that. The first view could be here from the climate crowd, I would say there is a lack. There's this big gap. If I look to the investors and to the public development banks, there's big opportunity, I would say. And coming like you from a think and do tank, we would say there's a lot of opportunity also to get creative, to create impact. So it's like a point of view we can take here. And I would like to now invite Júlio and then Nahed, which are both members from BNDES and AfD of IDFC, to show us what kind of solutions maybe are already out there to start off with, or maybe also what kind of questions are there for the solutions to unlock these barriers, and then we would enter into discussion. Da ist jetzt Júlio again. Júlio, yes, Júlio from BNDES, you have been there for 12 years. You are the Deputy Managing Director of the bank of BNDES from Brazil. The portfolio which you are in charge of is about $15 billion invested in different vehicles, credit, grants, and blended finance. So you have a good overview and also a good idea where there might be some opportunities out there. Please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, hello, good afternoon to all, for the presential guests here, the virtual panelists as well. I'd like to thank IDFC and the AfD for the invitation of BNDES to take part in this panel. This is a kind of theme that we are discussing a lot in Brazil, a lot in BNDES, how to scale up good projects, how to select good projects, how to scale up good projects, and how to mobilize commercial capital to the good projects. So, as I said, I'm the Deputy Manager Director responsible for social themes of BNDES, not only using different kinds of vehicles like grants, credit, mainly credit, but we are launching our road in the blended finance sector. So we have some different themes at my division, environment and climate, but also education, health, urban development, public management, public security, e-gov, and so on. So we have a lot of different themes under the same division, so you can mix the experiences of all these sectors to try to develop new products, mobilizing commercial capital. I brought a short presentation. Actually, it's not short, but I'm going to make it short to fit on time. And I split in two different parts. The first one, I'm going to show you a study by OECD that about blended finance in Brazil. So BNDES is one of the cases of OECD study, and this report was launched last year, 2020. And then on the second part of the presentation, I'm going to show some works we are doing right now to launch this year and next year regarding blended finance, more addressing the climate situation. So if you please, next slide, please. So just one slide to show what's the BNDES role and what's the size of BNDES for those who doesn't know very well BNDES. BNDES has a credit portfolio of around $16 billion on the allocated in green finance. Was the first Brazilian bank ever to issue a green bond in 2017, $1 billion. It reached 5 times the demand, and was the first bank in Brazil as well to launch a green financial bill last year, around $200 million. The green bond, the green bill was based mainly in renewable energy. We are the second largest financier of renewables in the world, according to Bloomberg. And we have several products there, as I said, credit, grants, and blended finance dedicated to green economy. So we are working on biomes restoration, implementation of agroforest systems, forest management, efficient machines, biogas, sanitation. So it's a wide variety of themes. And we are the manager of the Amazon Fund, which is the largest, I think is the largest one RED Plus fund in the world, with more than 100 projects supported by the fund. And we are also the manager of Brazilian Climate Change Fund, supported more than 800 projects over more than 10 years, offering long-term credit at below market rate interest rates. So that's in a very quick overview of the bank and the green economy. So next slide, please. So what's the stage of blended finance in Brazil? That's the evaluation by OECD. Next slide, please. So that's the cover of the study that was launched. The name of the study was The Role of Domestic DFIs in Using Blended Finance for Sustainable Development and Climate Action, the case of Brazil. So they found, next slide please, some interesting findings. So what I selected here, okay, is here, some of these key findings of the study. So the first one and the most important is DFIs are critical, and I think we all agree on that, are critical actors in blended finance. So, but remain underutilized in global efforts to bridge the SDG development investment gap. So that's the main finding of the study. Most of the blended finance is being channeled to renewables, banking, and financial services. The challenge is to catalyze commercial capital to all development priorities, including social and climate projects, forest conservation, decentralized power generation, climate-smart agriculture projects, and so on. So Brazil, the third main finding is Brazil can capitalize on its multi-layered DFI system. Brazil has a big national development bank, which is BNDES, but we have several regional development banks. So we have a very well-organized structure of development banks. You don't have to capitalize on that. And we need evidence base on blended finance to roll out and deploy the agenda in Brazil. I think that's, we all have a consensus about that. And the BNDES case studies show different structures and private capital mobilization, including guarantees, credit, and capital markets. That's going to show in the next slides, the following slides. And the new structure are being developed with unprecedented partnerships with international players and blended finance leveraged by grants in the bank. So I'm going to show the three different cases of that the OECD study in its article. The first one is not related so much to climate, but is the BNDES Investment Guarantee Fund. It's a fund, a guarantee fund managed by BNDES. It was created in 2009 in response to the financial crisis, and provides guarantee to MSMEs and individual entrepreneurs to facilitate access to credit from financial institutions, improving financing conditions for these clients. The goal is to leverage private finance in the sectors in these sectors by reducing uncertainty of projects and businesses, and guarantees can be provided to loan extended by BNDES either directly or indirectly through DFIs or other financial institutions. So that's a good example of how to using guarantees to reach more clients. So the fund has guaranteed loans of amount $2 billion, supporting 37,000 operations over this 10 years period. And 62% of the fund's clients were new borrowers who are not able to access BNDES resources before, demonstrating this mobilization potential of this instrument. So guarantee funds are a very strong instrument that we have to try to use more. So that's the first example. The second example is the BNDES grants and equity investments. I brought two, actually OECD studied two different examples. One is the case of Sunil. Sunil is a company of manufacturing and commercializing organic photovoltaic films to generate solar panel. So in BNDES, in 2015, BNDES approved a grant for technological innovation in this company, and with an option to buy shares of the company if the technological project was successful. So the project succeeded, and BNDES subscribed 30% of the company shares. So that's a good example of how to mobilize and how to bring this mix of grants and equity to the blended finance. I mean, to equity side of operations in the bank. The second case, including equity, is BUG, Agentes Biológicos, biological agents, which is a company that operates in biological pest control in agricultural crops, indirectly invested by Createch Fund. Createch Fund is a fund fostered by BNDES to small companies via equity. So it's a venture capital fund. So what were the results achieved? The first one, Sunil, has a success attracting capital for 4 new private investors, and it all began with the grant considered by BNDES. And the BUG received international recognition, being nominated technology pioneer of the World Economic Forum for enable a greener tomorrow by reducing the need of pesticides in Brazil through mass production parasitic wasps, which target pests that prey on crops. So you have two good examples of equity investments made by BNDES that was successful. And the last example is the BNDES green bond issuance that were made in 2017, $1 billion. It was the first ever for a Brazilian bank. And the bonds proceeds were mainly allocated into wind power generation projects in Brazil. The issuance allowed BNDES to diversify its investors base, since the bond mobilized conventional non-green investors. That was very surprising for us. Most portion of the investors were not green investors, and it was the first time to invest in a green bond. So the results is that this was an unprecedented transaction in Brazil, and also encouraged all other Brazilian financial institutions to issue green bonds in the market. And that was a series of green bonds in the market after that. And this, by financing wind power projects with a green bond as well, BNDES could contribute to develop the wind power industry in Brazil. It scaled up from 10 years ago to 10% of our energy grid today. And the bank has supported more than 100 projects, wind parks in Brazil until now. So it's a very successful history in Brazil of the support of BNDES, bringing capital, commercial capital, to fund this kind of projects. But as I said, that was the study of OECD. So, but as I said, it's not that much involving climate projects. So I selected 3 other examples that we are doing right now, that we're working right now to deploy in the next, this year, next years, the following years, more related to climate projects. The first one is one big project between BNDES, GCF, and IFED, which we call the Planting Climate Resilience in Brazil, in rural communities of northeast of Brazil. So you have the semi-arid region of Brazil, which has an experience of periodic droughts and chronic water scarcity, and that reduces agricultural crop productivity for smallholder families. So the project will address climate impacts for the most vulnerable farmers in that region by transforming family farmers' systems towards low emission and climate resilient agriculture. Is a $200 million project with a 34.5 million grants by GCF. So the leverage is around 5 times between the grants and the credit. And we expect to increase more water for this agriculture production, and 11.3 million tons of emission avoided, and 2 million families, people benefited by this project. So probably gonna launch this project next year. The second, next slide, please. The second example that I brought is an NDB, a New Development Bank fundraising that BNDES just approved few weeks ago. The NDB has approved a $500 million credit for BNDES to focus on supporting global climate change mitigation and adaptation in Brazil. The focus is going to be renewable energy, efficient machinery, sustainable urban mobility, solid waste, sustainable cities, native forests, and innovation. The idea is to implement these projects over the next 4 years. The results impact expected are to reduce 4 million tons of CO2 emissions by 2030, to contribute to reduce green gas emissions in Brazil, as well as support the accomplishment of Brazil's commitments on NDCs, as well the adaptation of the climate change in Brazil. So that's a big fundraising a few weeks ago, in fact. And the last example that I'm bringing to fit on time is the new BNDES Blended Finance Fund. So historically, we allocate a portion of our profit to grants for social, cultural, technological innovation, economics research. There's a portion of the profit of the bank that goes to these themes. But this year, I think probably in December and rolling out next year, we're going to launch the new BNDES Blended Finance Fund, which is a new fund dedicated to support pilot projects using blended finance structures and monitoring and evaluation systems to measure social environmental impact. So in the first round, BNDES will be using this to catalyze and mobilize commercial capital in projects to bioeconomy, mainly in the Amazon region, and urban development. That's the first round. We're going to select some projects in these teams, and the idea is to test, as going to be some pilot projects to test a variety of structures, different structures, to replicate the best practices and to adapt to local reality, because there is some projects that works well in Brazil, some projects that doesn't, and to scale up commercial investment for social environmental projects. So I try to make it quick to fit on time. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you, Júlio. That worked very well. Thank you very much. Without much ado, I would right away hand over to Saab. She has over 20 years experience in the financial sector. She has worked on investment banking, on private equity, and recently on climate finance. She has quite a good overview also on blended finance models. And she told me she has a provocative presentation. So, Nahed, over to you.
Yes, so I will try to shorten the presentation to leave some room for the discussions. I think that the discussions will be quite interesting. Presentation, please. So in this presentation, I will start by an attempt to define the barriers, the main barriers to scaling up climate finance. Suggest an approach to unlock these barriers, and then I will highlight a few examples of blended finance models that we at AFD have structured to lift the market constraints in terms of bankability and standardization of the green impact measurements, which then helps this new class of assets to emerge. First slide, please. So, next slide. I think we can list many barriers to the development of climate finance. And I do not pretend to have an exhaustive, holistic answer here. But if I were to identify a few of them, here are the ones that I would list. First of all, the difficulty to bring together, on one hand, the public policies in the form of a roadmap to net zero emissions, in the form of adequate regulatory frameworks and incentives and policies, obviously. The second arm is the financial market structure that promote and foster bankable projects and standardized green impact measurements. And the third arm is the technological innovation that will be needed in this green economic transition at scale. So these three pillars have to converge, and that in itself is a huge challenge. The second barrier that I see is the lack of understanding, of good understanding and pricing of climate risks by the markets. And the third barrier that I see in our markets is the challenge of bringing out international cooperation between countries. By that, I mean the international climate finance invested in developing countries to help them reach their nationally determined contributions. Now, in a context where we will need to move from the billions to the trillions, and where public finances are obviously largely insufficient to bridge the gap, I think blended finance has developed in recent years as a relevant solution. And so far, what we've seen is solution structures where we mix public concessional funds and private funds to basically enhance the risk-return profile for private investors and attract them, so some financial engineering. However, we're talking here about ramping up dramatically the investments and doing that very quickly, fast. And I would argue that in order to achieve scale, and scale matters to institutional private investors. I mean, I've heard this week, the financial sector saying we do have the trillions, but we need guidance. We need guidance from the governments. We need clarity. We need transparency on who bears what risks. We need transparency in the impacts that we need to achieve. And I think that, I would argue that we need to go further than just the financial engineering. We need really a coordinated approach between all the actors. And that is the challenge. How do you coordinate that? Next slide, please. So this slide highlights what I mean by a coordinated approach between the public authorities, the public development banks, and the private sector. So in this approach, unlocking the barriers will require leveraging the capacity of the public sector to bear risks, bring in patient capital to mobilize private sector's investments. That is what has been done through blended finance. But it will also have to rely on a coordination from the public authorities to align the investment strategies with the policies, with adequate incentives and regulations to put in place. And also, in addition, the public authorities can provide the guidance to the markets. So the markets prioritize the investments that contribute mostly to the roadmap to net zero. The public development banks, as anchor investors, they also have a key role to play to structure these new markets, and they know how to do that. They've done it with the emerging investments in emerging and developing countries. By promoting internationally recognized green measurement standards, and by developing the understanding and the pricing, the right pricing of the associated green benefits and risks. And finally, importantly, I think scaling up and speeding up the green economic transition may require, in my opinion, the private sector to co-invest not only with the public development banks, but also with the public authorities. So we may need structures that enable the public authorities to co-invest and dialogue with the private sector and understand their investment requirements while putting in place the adequate incentives and effective policies. And I realize that this will be tricky, but we're talking here about green economic transitions at countries' levels, and that have to be done very quickly. So the other, the final pillar is really the technological innovation, the innovation by and large, actually, not only technological innovation, it's also innovation in the business, in the approach of businesses, that will have, a green transition, economic transition will have to rely on. And I think that here again, governments will need to work with industries and the financial sector who can drive the innovation cycle, but who may need to rely on incentives and financial support to do so. Next slide, please. So here I'll go quickly on that. This slide really highlights some forms of blended finance models that we have successfully implemented and that can be further replicated or improved. So, for example, I highlight examples in the slide of de-risking financial mechanisms that we have put in place for the LDN fund, the BlackRock Climate Finance Partnership. But also the role of guarantees, really, to limit downside risks associated with the first loss tranches or the senior tranches. So with the LDN and BlackRock funds, we have structured multi-layered funds where AFD Group invests in the first loss tranches, while the private investors invest in senior tranches. And it has proved quite essential, actually, to attract private investors. Well, regarding guarantees, there are various actors in the market. Today, we have structured investment facilities with the EU, where they partially guarantee our own first loss tranches, investments in first loss tranches, so a bit like a reinsurance. The reinsurance industry takes on some risks from the insurance industries. And Guaranco is another player who uses blended finance, both by leveraging its public capital, by using AFD's contingency loan to provide a variety of guarantees, here again to catalyze private investments towards resilient climate investments projects in Africa and Asia. Next slide, please. So now I would like to walk you through another project, the Shandong Green Development Fund, a climate fund in China that, in which I think we went beyond the mere financial engineering of blending funds. And we built a partnership between the public and the private sector around this pilot climate fund. With a target size of 10 billion RMB, so approximately 1.5 billion US dollars, this is really the closest that we've done, I would say, I mean, my experience to scaling up climate finance. The fund not only gathers public and private funds, but the public interests are represented in a co-GP fund management structure. So the loans from the IFIs are sovereign loans that are on lent to the Shandong provincial government. The Shandong province is one of the most, or the most polluted state province in China. And they pledged to reach their peak of emissions by 2027, so 3 years before the central government's pledge by 2030. And so they had a strong incentive and interest in setting up this fund. So the structure of the fund involves two separate sets of expected returns. On one hand, you get the public investors who have a fixed income expected return, quite low, and renounce the upside potential, which is then distributed to private investors and increasing this way their likelihood of attaining an acceptable minimum expected return. However, more importantly in this project, the strong commitment and the sponsorship of the Shandong provincial government, whose investment actually is channeled through the Qingdao municipality. So they take, the Shandong provincial government takes the cash flows and currency risks associated with the underlying investments. So their strong commitment led to the adopting a special governance structure with two co-GPs that you can see here with the purple arrows. So the fund is co-managed by CICC, a fund manager who has the track record. I mean, it's the biggest investment bank in China. They have the track record and client base to lead successfully the fundraising, to deploy successfully the investment strategy. And SDIHG, which is the investment holding group of the Shandong provincial government, and which represents the public sponsors' interests. The structure enables actually a permanent dialogue between CICC, who represent the private investors' requirements, and the Shandong provincial government and the Qingdao municipality. Through the Shandong provincial government and the IFIs through SDIHG. And I think the Shandong provincial government provides guidance in the investment strategy of the fund in terms of what are the mitigation and adaptation priority investments in the context of the Shandong province and in the context of its pledge to reach its peak emissions by 2027. Next slide, please. So this slide is really to show that, in addition, as the public funds provide long-term, financial resources, a feeder fund has been created with a maturity of 20 years to take advantage of their patient capital. And this feeder fund then will invest in successive funds, so SGDF 1, 2, 3, which are structured with the investment horizon of 7 to 8 years that is expected by the private investors. Next slide, please. So to conclude, and in a nutshell, I think here are the key takeaways to be retained from this presentation. I think that scaling up climate finance, climate investments, requires really a coordinated approach between all the actors. Moreover, it bears its risks, which are not only technological risks, it's innovation risks by and large, and public policies, incentives and regulations, and maybe also a shift in the demand, on the demand side, and the use of concessional public funds or grants will be necessary, I think, to attract, at scale, the private investments. Another key takeaway is the role of the public development banks in disseminating internationally recognized impact measurement standards. This will help structure the market, the climate finance market. And besides, I think that achieving scale and outreach requires investing through funds and facilities, really. So investments at portfolio, program levels, and that will maximize the catalytic effect on private investments as well. In terms of lessons learned, I think should we try and replicate such project, I would like actually to trigger a discussion in this panel on the replicability of the co-GP model. So I'll come back to this later. Also in terms of lessons learned, I think a rigorous green assessment framework is important to justify the level of concessionality of the public funds, as the public sector understandably is accountable for the use of its, of the taxpayers' money. And finally, another lesson learned is really the importance of putting in place financial incentive mechanisms for the fund managers, based not only on the financial returns of the projects, but also on their green impacts. And these are obviously things that we've been working on a lot in this project, the last project that I presented.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Zahid. I would like to turn now to you, Paul. Before I introduce you, I'll ask you the question, so you have a little bit of time to prepare, basically. I would like to know, if you look at the barriers which have been presented at the takeaways, from a private sector investment side, which barrier would you like to have removed preferably? And, but that in an environment where we just talked about the impact as well, where the impact is now much more crucial than it used to be. I sometimes say the climate sector used to be a little bit on the side of the public discussion. Now we're center stage, as we see outside now with, 50,000 youths demonstrating, and they're going to ask critical questions about the impacts if public money goes into it. So the question is, what's the connection there? Paul, you are the global head of sustainability investing at BlackRock since April this year. You also know the public sector side, since you have been instrumental to the American efforts to the Paris Agreement, advising President Obama's administration and being part of that. But before, you also have worked in carbon finance in London in the climate change, in London-based climate change capital. So please, which barrier to remove and how?
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation. I think, what we're seeing here is there's a lot of innovation happening, a lot of creativity being applied within countries, transnationally. It's all very good. You mentioned BlackRock has a $673 million climate finance partnership with AFD and KfW and JBIC acting as the catalytic layer that has attracted, on a 1-to-4 ratio, institutional investors who want exposure to emerging markets, clean energy, but are only comfortable doing it at OECD levels of risk. So that's what a blended finance facility can do. The problem is that we will never scale up blended finance facilities to meet the gap that the CPI representative showed us at the beginning. That gap is too big. It takes a long time to design blended finance vehicles. Many thousands of hours of blood, sweat, and tears go into designing each one. They all have to be tailored to the preferences of LPs and GPs. So we are confident we can take our model, for example, and turn it into billions, but we're not going to turn it into trillions. And I don't think you're going to turn any of these facilities into trillions either, nor can we design 1,000 blended finance vehicles in the next 3 years so that we can fulfill the need. And if you think about the barriers in emerging markets, as someone who's also designed blended finance vehicles and worked in emerging markets myself, we have to confront the fact that private capital will not move into these markets at scale unless the investment environments are very different than they are today. This is well understood, but it takes time. And we don't have the time to wait for emerging economies to become investment grade for the private sector. If we were indifferent to the time scale here, then it would be okay. But we are not indifferent to the time scale. So, and we're not talking about the climate policy enabling environment issues. We're talking about underlying risks that keep private investors away, legal risk, enforceability of contracts, expropriation risk, currency convertibility, macroeconomic stability. These are the things that make it hard to bring private capital in. Or when private capital does come in to emerging markets, it demands a risk premium, right? If you build a wind turbine in Germany, you can find an equity financer who will only ask for 9% return on equity to build that wind turbine. If you want to build that same wind turbine in Malawi or Uganda, that investor, if they're willing to do it at all, will ask for 40% IRR. The gap between 9% and 40% cannot be filled indefinitely with a public subsidy from developed countries. It can be done catalytically. It can be a first of its kind project. That's what the GCF does. But it cannot be done indefinitely and at scale. That's the dilemma, right? And we've written about this recently as a firm, and our view is, even though that's true, if we're serious about decarbonization and avoiding climate risk, then because we can't address enabling environments quickly enough, and because we cannot scale up artisanal blended finance vehicles quickly enough, the only solution that is able to act quickly to scale up rapidly the investment is in fact public money, budgetary resources, not just higher capitalized development banks. And it's an inconvenient answer. It's not something that people want to hear. But if you are right now, OECD governments, when you hear about the 100 billion climate goal, I used to work on that when I was a US negotiator, right? Right now we have $150 billion a year of investment into emerging markets for climate, not including adaptation, not including China, but $150 million of clean energy investment, call it, per year. That needs to be $1 trillion. How are you going to get from 150 to $1 trillion? Well, that 150 is today underpinned by $16 billion in grant equivalent financing from OECD governments. So 16 billion of precious public money that's coming out of budgets is driving one way or another 150 billion. And if you want that 150 billion to be $1 trillion and you want to do it quickly, I'm afraid you're going to have to put more like 100 billion of grant equivalent public money to work. Now that's a shock, right? However, it still leads to a better outcome than having emission spiral out of control, because then the fiscal impact on developed countries and China and others in a position to contribute will be much higher. So it needs to be seen as an investment. So I hope that's not too provocative for you, but that's my view.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Paul. I think that's exactly what we need to get started off. I would like to turn to Eric, because you're on the other side, basically, sitting, I guess you're in Tsingtao, so ni hao to Tsingtao. you're sitting there and you get the money, but now you have to find the projects. That's usually the side I'm on, you know. Like if you scale by 10 times, you have to find 10 times the projects. And I see Júlio is nodding. I think he also has sometimes trouble finding the projects, I guess. It's not that easy. So Eric, tell us, where do you find them? How do you create the impact? And can you see the scale of 10 times already? I think probably you haven't invested the first 1.5 billion, or have you already? So tell us more about it. You're the managing director of CIIC Capital Management and the general manager of the Shandong Green Development Fund. You have more than 20 years of investment experience. Over to you, Eric.
Yes, thank you. Actually, this is a very good opportunity. And first of all, actually, I'm very glad to join this session. Actually, special thanks to Nahid from AFD who invited me, and also, I mean, very luckily, who used to work in ADB right now in GCF, who actually is the funding member for this project. But before actually, I talk about the project in particular, I would think this is very interesting to talk about the climate in general, because after I started this project about 2 years ago, actually I started with World Bank, but because of the Trump and the president of World Bank actually changed, so the China whole thing changed. So then Hubert from ADB invited me to join work with the Shandong province. So we started that. But after the last 2 years, I think, especially I think Nahid, I'm very glad to hear what you are saying about the barriers. You have been touched about quite a few important areas, which I was thinking over the last year. The first is, Bill Gates actually wrote a book, and the book is well translated in China. And recently, I think, just before this big event, he, I think, wrote an article in FT, which he first mentioned that without so-called climate technology breakthrough, basically it's very hard for us or for globally to achieve the 1.5 degree target temperature increase. And so, talk about the climate change, I realized the technology will play a very important role in this regard. Even, politically, countries are debating each other, etc. But finally, I would believe it's the technology plus, which Nahid mentioned, is the innovation will play a very important role in this regard. So that's, the key kind of experience or lesson I learned over the last 2 years. Second is we really need a kind of big roadmap. In China, I mean, if you read some of the news, luckily last year, President Xi has mentioned, the 30 and 60 so-called target, promised in UN. The second is this year, I witnessed the central government from China has set several very important policies from the central government to the local government. However, it will take time to reach to the provincial and also city level governments. So that is a good progress. However, as I mentioned, without the technology improvement, still the target is very hard to achieve. The second is actually, according to my study, actually one of the reasons I agree with Hubert when he asked me to join to work on the project or the fund is that at that time I already invested in electric vehicle. I invested in NIO, which is called China Tesla. Second is I also invested later on a battery. Right now it's the largest battery maker in China, which is called the CATL, who is supplying to Tesla and also other electric vehicles. So I started with the, electrification of the whole transportation sector. I believe there's a lot of opportunity investment there, and also there's a chance to invest in there. So the combination between the IFI's money and the private sector money, so we can mobilize the private sector money into the climate change area. So that's achieved through the technology breakthrough. And to talk about that, actually, I think it's very important that we realize, actually, a good example is Tesla. It starts with a very expensive model called the Model S, then it goes to cheaper models. Then it actually pushed, companies like Volkswagen, who initially, I think it's slow to the EV. Right now, I think they're pushed to adopt the EV, and also promised, I think, in certain years they will stop the diesel engine or the gasoline engine production. Right now, I think globally it's amazing. So the transportation sector, I think, is the very promising one, and I think rapid adoption of electric vehicle in China. Right, this year, I think it's the year-on-year growth is about 70 to 80%. For the EV adaptation. But of course, there's a lot of investment to be made in the charging infrastructure, etc. But I think there's good progress there. Then the second one, according to my company's research, is actually the biggest one is the energy sector. The energy sector, how to move from the fossil fuel sector to more sustainable or new energy. Is a big challenge because particularly this sector is very, in common sense, it's very bureaucratic. It's the state grid, it's the big power plants, coal plants. Those guys are really government officials. It's very stubborn and very hard to persuade them to adopt innovation. Of course, I don't want to mention, but they appear to say to their officials or upper bosses, say, we are going to adopt new technology or innovation. However, in reality, I mean, it's very hard to move. So I would think this is very hard to move. But I think energy sector is the most challenging one. But also, I think recently I realized the digitization and also the IT would play an important role in the climate or the carbon reduction as a whole. For example, some of you are joined on site, but for example, I from China and also Hubert from somewhere else, we all joined the session from Zoom. And Zoom is, just a software, but it actually reduced the transportation and also reduced a lot of carbon emission. But that is only on the kind of office side. On the industry side and also consumer side, I think the digitization and also the new IT technology can play an important role. And for example, I actually mentioned to Hugo Jenny used to be that, many consumers actually want to contribute to the global climate change. For example, personally, if I want to buy green electricity, let's say I pay 10% or 20% more. I think many consumers want to do that. However, right now, there's no technology to support that. So the digitization in general, I think, play an important. So in sum, I think the transportation, I believe, in the next 5 to 10 years, will speed up the electrification, and also the electricity will come from the solar or wind or green energy or green electricity. The energy sector is the most problematic, I would think. Then the digitization in general will play important. So that is all from the so-called technology and innovation side. Lastly, I would take some of the lessons or experience I learned from the Shandong Green Fund project. First of all, as Nahid mentioned, GP and co-GP, I think, is a good start. CICC, I work as a GP and the local party as a co-GP. However, actually, one of the lessons I learned is that sometimes if you start from a very, poor or lag behind region, you need a lot of effort, which, Jenny will mention probably later, that it's very challenging. However, whatever we set a good example, we make that work. We combine the IFIs money, thanks to ADB, KfW, AFD, and now joined by GCF. 3 IFIs putting money and long-term money to support the local community. And however, the challenge is that the local government still right now are lag behind in terms of mindset, I would think. They still view that as a cheap money. However, they do not necessarily appreciate the international practice. And also, we actually follow the GCF green standards, which it's very hard for them to adopt. They would think, why you put the fund into the, for example, the local bus transportation, which generates zero return. So probably that is a lesson I would learn. But luckily, I think China right now.
Maybe I have to come in here because otherwise we won't have enough time. Thanks a lot for your views on it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
It's energy, it's transport, it's digitalization, very general, I would say. But I think the question is where to find the projects, because I know that development banks, they would work a lot in the energy sector. There's plenty of money available in the energy sector sometimes. But then the question is how to find the impactful projects, how to find it maybe also on a smaller scale. And that's why I would like to turn to Dinesh Sri Shankar. He's the director of Guarant Co. And they provide local currency guarantees. So I would be very curious to hear about where do you find the project and what would happen if we do what Paul said. Now it's factor 10. You just have 10 times more money. Can you find the projects and the guarantees for 10 times more money? And where?
Hi, thank you. Very happy to be here. Thanks to AFD for inviting me. Indeed, yeah, there is a challenge, particularly in my background is emerging markets, in getting the pipeline to meet the demand from international investors. So our experience is, we started off based in London and found that we needed to get on the ground presence to source the projects more and more, because there's information asymmetry, and the further away you are from these markets, the harder it is to find out what's actually happening on the ground. So now we have offices in Singapore and Nairobi, and we have, we've got staff who are sourced from the markets as well, so their local connections can be used to leverage this. One of the reasons I think that it's difficult to find these projects is it takes time to develop them in these markets, right? Not only are the technologies or green are relatively new, or arguably not so much these days, but even the basic financing systems like project finance, PPP structures, they're not understood fully. And so what we find is that demonstration effect is really important. So, what might take 3 years for us to do the first solar project in one territory. So for example, we did the first grid connected solar project in Bangladesh a few years ago. And that took a few years to gestate and to execute. But then once we did it, a lot of the local players saw, okay, this is possible. A PPP structure, we know what it is now. We know that there are bank financing, local banks to support it. And we know that there are offshore entities like Guarant Co that can help provide, work with the banks to extend tenor, so we get the tenor of financing we needed, or we can get the local currency financing we needed, which makes the project itself more viable because you're not bringing hard currency on and creating the FX mismatch. So by doing that demonstration impact, you're teaching others that this can be done, and then that hopefully speeds up the process next time. Similarly, you've got regulators and others on the ground who are also getting to grips with these new kind of concepts. And when you take them through one example, they learn, and then they can do it again. It's also, motivation, because regulators and everybody, you take it in the green context, and they also have different motivations. So one experience that we've had is, and again in Bangladesh, in the capital market space, we were moving to do one of the first corporate guaranteed bonds. And we found that the regulators there were really keen to support us because capital market development for them was critical. Because just relying on the banking sector for their growing local businesses wasn't enough, because the businesses were growing to a size where they're reaching single obligor limits. And it was from a structural perspective locally, it wasn't working. You couldn't keep loading on these exposures to the bank. So they were very happy to work with us and support us to build the regulations to facilitate issuance of bonds. Now, if you then put that green angle on it, then that's even more incentive. They're not just doing this for, reducing carbon emissions, but they're doing this to build their capital market presence. So you've got different authorities within the governments then waking up and getting interested and saying, yes, let's work together, let's help these players. And one of the challenges often is trying to find somebody who can act as an effective project manager to coordinate the different stakeholders, the regulators, the local project sponsors, the onshore financiers, the offshore financiers, the MFRs, the IFRs. And that role can be played by arrangers. Often, Garanco has played that role. We're a credit guarantor, but we're far from passive. We usually sit on the front line, liaise with everybody, and often act unofficially as arrangers and help regulators to understand the long-term perspective. So, through doing that and through demonstrating replicability and scale, that's probably one of the key factors here. The other point is that also then translates across to the demand side. So I think there's an acknowledgement that investors in the international markets, for developed markets, there's huge demand for green assets. But when you move to the emerging markets, there is more reticence generally about taking on emerging market risks. And there's probably a gap between risk perception and risk reality. But that same concept of demonstration effect and replicating works there as well. And I'll talk about an example in Vietnam. So, we've done 2 bonds in Vietnam. They both had to be 100% guaranteed by ourselves to get the institutional investors to invest. Now, the third deal we're currently structuring is with an NBFI, non-banking financial institution, that's going to be certified green because they're going to use the proceeds of the bond to lend to distributed solar and rooftop solar projects. And we've managed to get investors interested now because they understand the guarantee, they understand the capital market angle, and with this this demand for green, they're happy to take a partial guarantee from us, right? And so that means that that you can leverage that guarantee more and get more private sector investment in there. But it also means the bond is cheaper, and that will open it up then to other parties in Vietnam, for example, to say, actually, this technology, this method of accessing capital is, although perhaps not as straightforward as doing a bank loan, long term gives me access to more capital, deeper capital markets, both onshore and offshore, longer tenor, and potentially at better rates. And so that again, that's replicability leads to scale, and that's that's critical as well. Taking a few steps back, you also need to go back upstream because you need these underlying projects to be developed, and that's where I think patient capital from governments and grant facilities are really critical because they can work with governments to build the underlying frameworks, build the PPP structures that will then support the private sector in the country. So then go out and say, right, let's go and build a concession model to start tendering for solar, right, on-grid solar and hydro, and and then let's start certifying green real estate projects, etc. So that's there's a role for the public sector there, and I think if my personal view is that the role of the public sector sort of should taper off. So the further upstream you are, the more heavy public sector participation you need. But as you go down the life cycle of a project, it should be reduced as the private sector can get more and more involved. And the blended finance model that my colleagues have talked about is the way to go, where then the public sector should be coming in and giving a sliver of support, and that should be leveraged, right? And again, Garanco is a good example of that. We've got about $317 million of funded equity. We've issued $1.2 billion of guarantee off the back of that. And we've mobilized about $5 billion of private sector investment. It's not trillions, I understand, but it's a start, right? And maybe you don't need to go out and start doing these more and more blended finance facilities. Maybe you look at what's out there and you look at how you can leverage the private sector onto that and to support it and grow and scale. So I think I'll give up others opportunity to speak, but the theme is replicability, scalability, and leverage.
Thank you, Dinesh. Let me take this away to Gauthier Queru. He's the director of the Land Degradation and Neutrality Fund, and which is managed by Mirova, and he has also support from the Agence Française de Développement and the European Investment Bank for this fund. Are guarantees enough? Because sometimes we also support the European Commission on this, and they are very big fans of guarantees. So they say guarantees and everything is solved. I'm pretty sure Paul would disagree. It's my assumption. I also disagree. So are guarantees enough for something which you are doing, or do you need something else from the public side? And where can the private sector come in? Or how can you convince the private sector to come in even more? Thanks. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for the good questions. And really, all what that was presented previously sounded really like music to my ears. I think we are sharing the same vision. There are debates on how to improve things, how to scale things up. But I think in the analysis, we share many views. I work for Mirova, which is a fund management company, a private fund management company, and we are used to dealing with large institutional investors where the trillions are. And we try to convince them to allocate more capital into climate finance. They've done a lot in renewable energy for the past 20 years. This is accelerating, this is developing, this is big, but we need to do more. And there are many other sectors that require much more funding, but where indeed there is high risk perception. I'm myself working in the field of sustainable land use, sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry. We need to restore land to prevent further deforestation, to protect nature. In developing countries, this is very new to these investors. So indeed, support is needed. But before just speaking of public support, I think it's very important to mention that in the first place, we need good private sector companies also on the ground, entrepreneurs, operators that would develop solutions. And the ultimate objective is for these sectors to grow, for these companies to become very big so that they can attract private funding without any public support. But indeed, in the first place, we need de-risking in a way or another. I have this great experience with the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund that was initiated 6 years ago when no one were really speaking about nature-based solutions or not as we do now at COP26, but there was really a request from the UN to set up a fund that would help project developers on the ground to restore degraded land. And by working with Agence Française de Développement, who acted as a sponsor of the fund, we could increase the knowledge, the understanding of the risk and also of the opportunities, and could build this fund where public money and de-risking represent only 20% of the fund size, which is 200 million, and bring this de-risking that can really unlock further private financing. And this is together with also a technical assistance facility, also funded with public investors that can help accompany project developers to become more robust. So yes, guarantee de-risking can help, but really with the ultimate objective of making the sector investable, bankable. And this has worked. This has worked. We are developing, supporting many entrepreneurs on the ground. And I agree with Paul previously that these artisanal funds will not be enough. We need, trillions, but still there is also a replication effect, a demonstration effect. It has worked in the renewable energy for the last 20 years, as I said, where the sectors was initially really supported by public capital and public policies, but now it is really financed by the private sector much more easily. With other sectors such as nature-based solutions, forestry, agriculture, which are maybe more challenging, there can be also this demonstration effect, this replication effect, and these artisanal funds can have really play a role and create a real momentum, a catalytic effect in the entire market. And there are many initiatives that can be also here to accelerate this. So different ways of providing, of combining public and private money, but we also collaboration, big coalitions to scale this up by spreading the word and replicating what has been working on the ground, and progressively with less and less public money. Yeah, it works, but we need to do much more. And this is why it's great to be here with you to continue the discussions and team up together.
Thank you, Gauthier. I would like to turn to Hubert Jenny. I'm actually surprised that nobody of the fund manager said, just give us more money and we can do more. Maybe I missed that. I think that would have been the answer I would have expected. Hubert, or Hubert, you're working as Senior Infrastructure Specialist at the Green Climate Fund. You are one of those organizations, or representing one of those organizations, who actually bring in the public money into the system, and also work on these artisanal fund systems, which you describe. What I hear is that they might sometimes be also complicated and take a long time. Yeah, there's always time, and time is something we probably don't have at the moment, at least not if you want to get to scale quickly. So what are your thoughts on that? Which barriers would you like to remove? Over to you, Isabelle.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for your kind word on the Shandong Green Development Fund. That was really a great experience as teamwork to be able to work in a country like China with like-minded people and progress the cause of climate finance in the country and for the world. I think, yes, project preparation takes time. And I always say we can make a good project a better project, but I cannot make a bad project a good project. So it's very important when we start, and I have a mixed career, private sector, public sector, in development bank, and now at the Green Climate Fund. So before we were looking at development impact, now I'm looking at climate impact. So for example, in water resource management, if you come to me with a project that is induced by bad practice in water resource management, I'm not interested. I say, please go to World Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank. They will help you. But if your water resource problem is induced by climate change, then the Green Climate Fund will look at it and we will help you. But we need a very good project preparation. And I would say is the Shandong Green Development Fund took 2 years to develop. And that's the time you need in order to do your homework. And Paul mentioned it very well. It doesn't matter what we think as a donor, a public donor, if the private sector is not on board. If I tell them, okay, this is a fund that will generate 5% internal rate of return, they say, thank you very much, and we will never see them again. So we need to test the appetite of the market for any project, what they're willing to do. Why we have in the Shandong Green Development Fund this series of sub-funds, Fund 1, Fund 2, Fund 3, because the fund is there for 20 years. AFD, ADB, Green Climate Fund put money for 20 years, KfW for 15 years. But from our homework and the work with Eric as the managing director of the fund management company, we realized that private sector will not invest for more than 8 years, maybe 10 years. So you need to adapt. And you also work in a context where the regulation, the regulatory environment is changing. So you need to design a 20-year fund in a flexible enough manner so that in year 2, in year 5, in year 10, you're not stuck and you cannot do. And one of the major changes that came from the beginning of the project preparation and the end of the project preparation was that such fund could only invest in equity. And if you wanted to do debt, well, you go to commercial bank. That was the new regulation from the policy in China. So very well aware of the background, very well aware of the appetite of the private sector so that you come. And then come from a GCF perspective, the climate change impact. And as Paul mentioned, we're not here to, we don't have the means to finance trillions of projects. So we're here to do model projects. We're here to give the blueprints of good projects. Is the Shandong Green Development Fund a good project? I think it's a good concept. But when my boss told me, oh, now we need to replicate this all over Asia, I said, no, we need to have the lesson learned because this is innovative, this is transformational. We need about 2 years and get Eric feedback. Okay, what is working, what is not working, and be able to incorporate those lessons learned into the next catalyzing fund in order to maximize the climate benefit because we are putting public money and also attract the interest of the private sector. Now, public institutions are usually very dogmatic about private sector, but the reality is that we are not going to be able to meet the climate finance target in mitigation and adaptation if we don't have the backup of the private sector. And in the private sector, I mean private investor, institutional donor, and commercial finance. I don't want to take too much of your time. If you have any other question, I can answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci, Hubert. we're already getting to the end, and Paul has to run in a second. So I would like to ask one more question to the people here on the panel with me, right here physically in Glasgow. And that is, I learned one thing, like I'm working 20 years in development cooperation and 15 years in green finance. If you want to find out if things work at scale, you have to try them at scale. Because if they work in a small scale, it's always like a nice prototype, but then if you scale it up, it's very different. And I think Hubert, you just said the same. It's basically you need to, if you want to replicate it, you also need to have tried it. Which one would you like to try at scale?
Well, I will answer your question in a slightly different way,
of
if
course.
I might. I think the two interesting ideas for scale that I might offer are, one, we need an investment banking function at the intersection of public and private. Because we've spent a lot of time building these closed-ended funds, which we've talked about before, but we don't really, public and private capital do not do great working together. And so what's missing is an investment banking function whose only job is to do deals. And that can speak the language of both MDBs and DFIs on the one hand and private capital markets on the other. We don't have such a thing today at scale. But if you got a 200 climate bankers together, sourced from both public and private sector, and put them into a unit whose only KPI was to generate, climate deal flow, that is a intervention at 100 times larger scale, potentially, than crafting the next blended finance facility. The second is a replicable model is national green investment banks. We were not going to decarbonize emerging markets through a straw from international institutions. And the Shandong Fund is a good example of a locally based fund. And local financial institutions understand their markets better than international financial institutions, with apologies. And so in the long run, we're going to have local green banks that need to be doing the heavy lifting. And those green banks can offer a wholesale investment solution for the GCF. The GCF has already funded seeded green investment banks in Southern Africa with DBSA and in Mongolia and maybe other places too. So we can't overwhelm the GCF with 1,000 projects a year from Indonesia or Brazil or India. If there exists a publicly owned, commercially operated green investment bank in each jurisdiction that can take wholesale concessional finance from the international level, that's a powerful model, I think, to replicate and try to scale quickly. But I'm sure people will disagree, but that's,
Thanks for the inspiration,
Thank you for inviting me.
Júlio, you're one of those national banks.
Yes.
So which one would you like to scale up and web?
Yeah, actually, BNDES is a mix of development bank and it's not an investment bank, but you have the equity branch of BNDES part is a whole full-owned subsidiary of the BNDES, only focused on the equity side of the investments. So what we've done so far, our vision for so far is that we tested a lot of different models, different types of projects, and you have to streamline, of course. I mean,
just
that's...
Say thank you so much for coming.
I agree that the main budget is the public budget. So what I'm trying to do right now is to streamline, to narrow the alternatives and to develop some models, some frameworks to not to build several different models, but to build some different models can be possible to mobilize commercial capital. I totally agree that it's not easy, but the wind power sector is one major achievement in Brazil. That's the way we did.
And if we don't start trying, we're not going to succeed.
Yeah, you have to try. You have to try. Yes.
Ahead. What would you like to scale?
Sorry. Scale, I don't know, but I think what I would like to see is the right to try and make mistakes and think out of the box. I think we really need to, come up with all kind of innovative ideas and potential solutions. I hear that, in traditional orthodox finance, you don't really mix up public and private finances at scale. And what I do like is, some ideas that are really disruptive and say, like Paul suggested, create a bank, an investment bank that is really at the crossroads of public investments and private investments. Any idea really, I think, is welcome if we really want to scale up, and we are serious about speeding, because we're talking really about doing that in the next 10 years.
Thank you very much, Nahed. Thank you very much, Júlio. Thank you very much, my speakers which have been virtually with us. So Baysa, Gauthier, Eric, Hubert, and Dinesh. Thank you very much for listening, also the people who are here and the ones virtually. And I would like to say have a good weekend, but we have one more session to come. So have a good further afternoon. Thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.